This is Chapter 13, Part 4. So we'll continue on going over just some basics, basic features of prisons. Of course, we have the various levels of security, going from minimum security to maximum security. With minimum security prisons, we have greatly reduced level of staff supervision, so it's going to be less expensive because there's fewer staff. Generally, no perimeter security, meaning walls or a fence, and it's designed for non-threatening inmates with less serious offenses. So those who are classified as being sort of posing little threat of either dangerousness in the facility or little threat of running away, more likely to get a minimum security sort of sentence. So of course, perhaps the key thing, or one of the key things to differentiate minimum security from higher levels of security, is the intensity of the supervision, the intensity of the staff, and also how much freedom of movement there is. In minimum security facilities, there's a lot more freedom of movement among the inmates, and less and less so as you move up to medium and maximum security. With medium security, these facilities have a secure perimeter, generally double fences with armed vehicles that patrol. See, so this is significantly higher level of security. More security personnel. Inmates of various levels are housed there. Most inmates are found in this type of facility. So this is the most common type. It's what you probably think of the image you have, perhaps either medium security or even maximum security. You might have that image based on what you've seen in the media. So this is the medium security is typical, and you do have a range of dangerousness or risk factors among the inmates, and you can have different areas where inmates of different risks may be housed. Or with these medium security facilities, you might have a certain wing that'll be higher security for higher risk inmates. So you can sort of have a range there within a medium security facility. It may not be exactly the same for everybody. Maximum security, these inmates typically have a history of violence, so it's very much about risk and threat both to the inmates and also to the staff. Housing is typically in cells. Perimeter, so we're talking more time alone, more likely to be a solitary sort of condition. Perimeter security is significant, double fences, armed towers, much more difficult than, say, minimum security when it comes to being able to escape. Very difficult to escape. Security features are more intensive. Inmates have less movement and less interaction. So that's a big part of these maximum security facilities, is you spend a lot of time alone. You may spend most of the day in your cell, maybe getting a little bit of time, an hour or something perhaps, to get out of the cell and to maybe do some exercise, walk around, that sort of thing. But again, you may be limited in the amount of contact you have with other inmates. And this, again, is sort of considered to be a form of punishment when you're kept alone a lot. That's sort of used as a way to punish people because inmates don't like it. They'd rather be around other inmates. Classification. The process by which correctional officials determine the prison and security level to which an inmate should be assigned. So you have a process, and they'll even use a lot of sort of social science research, criminological research, which says, okay, if you have this sort of characteristic, that's a risk factor. That it's a signal that you could be more of a danger, a risk to others, or perhaps a flight risk. Somebody who might attempt to escape. And they'll even use these sort of assessment methods that are kind of, they're based on scientific methods that try to determine where it makes the most sense to put an inmate. So this classification is a process that inmates will go through to figure out really where, based on the best data and the best forms of classification, where these inmates belong, what level of security. Inmates may be reclassified, so they can move up or down during their sentences based on their behavior. So if they're model inmates, just perfect, then they might be able to be reclassified and be considered to be categorized as being a lower risk. and therefore that they could be given a less confining sort of setting, a lower security setting based on their behavior. And it could go the other way too. If you're getting into fights, if you're attacking, assaulting people, that you're posing a risk to others, to staff, then you could get reclassified and could end up in more of a maximum security kind of setting. So that's a process that goes on of a formal, even scientific way of trying to determine how risky somebody is. Now, an important term, couple of important terms that come out of sociology that folks have studied prisons and other what they call total institutions. One of the leading researchers and theorists in sociology in the modern era would be Irving Goffman, and he spent a lot of time in institutions like especially mental health institutions. And what he means by this total institution, it's an institution that controls all aspects of a person's life. Life is characterized by planning and regimentation. And most of us live much freer in diverse circumstances. I mean, most people, they have jobs, they have family lives, they may have recreational activities, they may belong to different organizations, they might belong to some local church, et cetera, et cetera. And so they have many different domains in their lives with different people they're involved with and different people who may be supervising them or have authority over them, or maybe they don't, in some settings, they don't have anybody that's an authority over them. They may be the authority. It certainly might be kind of the authority if they're a parent at home. But in a prison, it's a total institution where your life 24/7 is in that prison. And every aspect of your life is sort of guided, controlled, regulated by an institution, by an organization. So it's a pretty intense kind of situation there. Control is much more centralized in prison than in normal life. No doubt about that. Another term here, mortification. The loss of personal identity that comes with admission to a total institution, such as a prison or jail. Individualism and privacy is lost. So just imagine everybody kind of wears the same outfit, same uniform. You have the same schedule throughout the day, eat together, these meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, very regimented, different activities during the day. Everybody's doing the same kind of things. And so it kind of feels like like a factory existence where you could sort of lose a sense of being an individual and being basically just one the same as everybody else, in that you're all kind of, in a sense, dress the same and act the same and are part of the same schedule. And so researchers refer to this kind of situation as mortification. Now, the pains of imprisonment, and this was developed by another leading sort of prison researcher and criminologist, Gresham Sykes. 5 deprivations that inmates face: the loss of liberty, goods and services that you're able to get, have access to out in the free world, heterosexual relationships, autonomy or freedom, and ability to come and go as you please and control your life as you please. That's kind of out the window. And also security. Even though prisons are supposed to be secure, there's quite a bit of violence sometimes there. You can be attacked. You can be sexually assaulted. You can be sexually controlled and victimized by a more dominant inmate. So we've mentioned these pains of imprisonment in an earlier discussion, and when you're talking about punishment, if I recall. So we'll leave that there for now, but you get the idea that there are certain, it's not just that your freedom is taken away. There's other things that are taken away as well. Contraband is another term. Any item that prison or jail inmates are not permitted to possess: illegal drugs, alcohol, and you often get maybe cigarettes, that kind of thing, gets passed around in prisons and made, either somebody sneaks them into the facility, or you get this sort of homemade alcohol that gets made within the prison walls. That these prisoners are often very ingenious and come up with a lot of things you would never think of, because for one thing, they have a lot of time on their hands in there, and you get some creative individuals come up with creative things like homemade alcohol, that kind of stuff. So, but that's all referred to as contraband, and of course the prison tries to control the flow of these sorts of things, but there's typically this underground market where these items of contraband get passed around and exist in these prisons, and they're sort of kind of like money. If you have these things, they're you can trade those with other people for other things that you want, that kind of thing. So it ends up being almost like a sort of underground money system. Now, prisonization, that is an inmate's acceptance of the unique culture of the prison environment, including its norms, jargon, lifestyle, and conditions. So you're just saying that, like any institution, you're going to tend to have a particular culture that's going to grow and evolve there. And so there's concern that inmate internalizes antisocial violence, which leads to recidivism. So this is a problem with prisons, is that especially you send a young person there who may have gotten into trouble, criminally, but may not necessarily be a hardened criminal. But the experience of prison and this prisonization we're talking about here, that you can absorb this very hard, streetwise, amoral system that these prisoners will teach you in prison, that you can internalize and become a more hardened prisoner or criminal, and more even committed to crime, more committed to that than when you entered the prison doors. And so you can see that this is a problem. It's a fundamental problem with prisons, is that it doesn't do a very good job of correcting individuals, that it can actually go the other way and make them more firm and more deeply committed to a criminal way of life. Now, there's a couple of contrasting hypotheses you should be familiar with. Importation hypothesis, an explanation of prisonization that inmates bring antisocial values into prison that were learned on the streets, and this shapes the prison culture. And I think both of these hypotheses we'll talk about have some validity to them, that of course criminals, when they come into prison, they're not babies, they're not blank slates. They've already picked up a lot of values, lifestyles and habits and ways of looking at the world, certain criminal values, pro-criminal values they bring with them into prison. And so it's no surprise and no shock that you get a certain pro-criminal culture in prison when prison is made up of a bunch of criminals who brought those values with them into the prison. So there's certainly some truth to the importation hypothesis. But the other contrasting hypothesis is called deprivation hypothesis. And according to this, prisonization sort of is the result of prison's a hard place. There's deprivations. We talked about all the things that you go without. You lose your freedom, you lose your family, your connections, heterosexual relationships, a lot of the nice things that you get to enjoy in the free world. So it's not the greatest life inside. So the idea is that the hardness of your living circumstances causes you to harden in your criminality, to deepen in your pro-criminal values. It comes from the hard ways that you experience while you're in prison. So next point is that both of these models, importation and deprivation hypotheses, probably going to have some validity to them. One criticism is that both explanations ignore the fact that inmates also bring their internal traits, their personalities, with them to prison. Example, hot temper, lack of empathy, psychopathy. Yeah, this is typically what you get in very often with criminological research, is you get sociological type hypotheses that, before prison you learn certain values and you bring those values in with you to the prison. Or life in prison is really hard, and so that tough, hard life hardens you. Those are both basically sociological explanations. Well, that leaves out completely a large area, an important area in criminological research, which is that people are not only shaped by their circumstances, but they have internal traits, really internal traits that are rooted in brain structure and functioning, and that a lot of how you behave comes from the from these internal traits, from the way that you're, going down to a biological level, the way that your brain functions, and the way that you have certain habits, traits that help you or lead you to respond to your circumstances in certain ways. Research shows very clearly that criminals tend to have certain personality types, certain traits like psychopathy, like a violence problem, like a callousness, lack of empathy, lack of concern about people they victimize, and on and on and on. Impulsivity, learning disabilities, lots of things that predispose them to criminality. So they bring, of course, all of these traits into prison, and that certainly plays a role in what's going on too. But that's typically neglected in the research because most researchers have a real sociological orientation and tend to downplay or even just ignore the personality research that looks at the things inside of a person that help determine how they behave, that sort of thing. So that's an important point to make there. Couple final points on women's prisons. Women's prisons did not become common until the late 1800s. So there's always been only just a fraction of female inmates compared to males, about 10%, a much smaller number. So it's never historically been as big of a problem as male criminality. So female trends in criminality have tended to lag behind the male trends. So traditionally, male inmates were sort of viewed as unfeminine. So domestic skills were encouraged in prisons, sort of training women in traditional skills and responsibilities that a homemaker would, skills that a homemaker would have, that kind of thing. So that was definitely a difference between male and female inmates traditionally, and the kind of things that they did and they were trained on while they were incarcerated. As with male prisons, the shift has been towards incapacitation, not rehabilitation. So for both males and females, the past few decades has been kind of a get tough period, sort of an impatience with rehabilitation, and the idea that, well, if we can't stop people from committing crimes, we'll at least get them off the streets and incapacitate them so that they can't victimize people in open society, right? So it's been a harder, tougher sort of approach for women as well as men. And as a matter of fact, there's been sort of a narrowing in the old days, and even there's still some signs of this, but definitely in the old days, women tended to be treated more leniently by the criminal justice system. They were seen as more likely to, that in need of a second chance or deserving of a break, or more likely to change their ways and to correct themselves, maybe less likely to go to prison because they had family responsibilities, because they had children at home they needed to take care of. So you tended to have kind of a, this, they called it a chivalry. The research talks about a chivalry hypothesis, that traditionally women tended to get more lenient treatment by the criminal justice system than men, but that this gap has narrowed as sort of women's roles have become more similar to men's roles, and women have entered more into careers that men traditionally dominated, and those sorts of role changes and the ways that society looks at women differently than they did in the past. You see less of that chivalry, less of that double standard, and women are more likely to be treated the same way as the men do within the criminal justice system. So it hasn't been completely eliminated, but it's not as big of a difference as it used to be. About 7% of inmates are female. So even though you've seen sort of less preferential or less lenient treatment of females, still the vast majority of prison inmates are guys. Females are less likely to have committed violent crimes. There's still a big gap between males and females in violent crime, especially serious violent crime like homicide or rape or armed robbery. Those are still mostly committed by men. But we have seen a narrowing in the gap where women are more likely now to go to prison for drug sales, for White-collar crimes, financial crimes, theft, writing bad checks, counterfeiting, those kind of theft or financial sorts of crimes. There's not as big of a gap between males and females as there used to be. There's still a gap, but the big gap that still remains nowadays is the really serious violent crime. Homicide, rape is still, 90% plus committed by men. Finally, research suggests that female inmates' interaction may be less hierarchical than among men. So that's one kind of cultural difference or behavioral difference you see in male prisons compared to female prisons. Is that, and this, because whenever you get a bunch of guys around, and I think this is particularly true of convicts, of inmates, that with guys you tend to get real hierarchy. Somebody ends up being the alpha dog, the guy on top, and then they get the followers. And so it's very much a hierarchical sort of thing like you'd see in the military, or like you'd see this. Typically you get a bunch of men together and you get hierarchy. With females, there's a tendency to be more egalitarian, to be more kind of like a family or like friends who are more or less a top dog and followers. Although there's some of that, but it's not as black and white and not as clear. That females tend to have more somewhat more equal relationships and interactions with each other. So you don't get as much of the extreme gang behavior like you get with the men. The men formed gangs with shot callers at the top and followers, and sort of that chain of command like you'd see in the military, or the kind of thing you'd see in organized crime, where you've got the Don at the top and you got the captains and you got the soldiers and all that kind of thing. So that's a gender difference that you tend to see in male prisons versus female prisons. Okay, of course, there's tons of other things we could talk about, and I'm going to post a video so that we can talk more about probation and parole, which doesn't really get talked about in this chapter much. So make sure and take a careful look at that documentary.